Chinese noodle watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm Jordan Schneider here today with Oona Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, both professors at the Yale Law School. They most recently wrote The Internationalist, subtitled How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World. Scott and Oona, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Jordan.
So while this is a book not specifically on China, in talking about shifting global world order, China's, of course, going to be central to that conversation. So just 2 days ago, the People's Daily, the Chinese Party's main mouthpiece, published an article which said that the world needs China as all humans are living today with a shared future. That, in turn, creates broad strategic room for our efforts to uphold peace and development and gain an advantage. So shifting the world order towards China's terms is certainly something that's in the back of the mind of the senior party leadership. So today in this episode, we're going to explore the last time that main backbone of the global legal order shifted. And to lead us into that conversation, we have a great new piece of scholarship out that we're going to discuss. So to start off, could I first ask you guys a personal question about what first brought you into studying international law in the first place?
Well, I will take this one to start off. I mean, I have been interested in international law for a very long time. I think it's fascinating because, of course, it's the way in which global legal challenges can be effectively addressed, and as an area of study, it's especially challenging because there's so many moving parts. It's sort of like saying that you study domestic law. I mean, there's so many things going on under international law, and so that's also part of what really drew me to it, and I've now been studying and thinking and writing about international law for nearly 2 decades, and it's only become more interesting and important over the course of that time.
My interest in international law comes from the fact that I'm a legal philosopher, and I study the nature of law, and so much of legal philosophy concerns domestic law, where you have a centralized enforcement mechanism. You have the state, and you have courts, and you have police. And international law lacks a world state, lacks a world police, and was really interested in how a legal system that lacks an executive agency like domestic law works. And so Oona and I began talking about the particularities of international law and how different it is than domestic law, and it just seemed like a really interesting example of how you might have rules in the absence of physical coercion.
Sure. So going into that, again, you talked about how the world is run by not a world police, but sort of norms. So let's talk about the pre-World War I world and what were the sort of operating assumptions that European nations had evolved through the Middle Ages and beyond.
I started in my first answer to you, I said that international law doesn't have centralized physical coercion. There are no world police. But before 1928, there was physical coercion. It just wasn't centralized, meaning that any time a state had violated the legal rights, a rule vis-a-vis another state, that state had the right to use force in order to right the wrong. Now, that use of force was called war. And so before 1928, the basic rule of what we call the Old World Order was that if a state had been wronged, it had the right to use physical force in order to right that wrong.
So one of the things you talk about is that it's not not only the right, but also the justification that states wanted to publicize. War manifestos you guys focused on in particular, which I thought was a fascinating source. Could you explain what that was and what the point of these documents were? One of the fascinating documents that you used to illustrate this concept of what triggered war were war manifestos. They were found across the world and sort of reflect differences in values, as well as what sovereigns decided wasn't worth fighting over. So could you talk a little bit about this source and what you were able to glean from it?
Yeah, so when we were studying the period that Scott was just describing, the Old World Order, we stumbled across these documents that were called war manifestos. And they were documents we'd never really heard of before, at least I'd never heard of before, this idea that states would issue these manifestos when they went to war that would lay out their reasons for going to war. And when we started reading them, we found that they were amazing treasure trove of information about why states were going to war, what all their various reasons were for going to war. And the reasons that they included were all kinds of things that today would be considered utterly illegitimate. So things like wife stealing, but even more mundane things like property destruction or interference with trade relations or debt collection, or violations of international treaties. And so we realized that one way that we could really document how different the Old World Order was from the world that we live in today was to go through and catalog all of the reasons that states were giving in these war manifestos. And so that was one of the sources that we looked to try and understand not just what did the treatise writers say about war during this era, but what were states actually doing and how were states themselves defending their decision to go to war.
Can I just add that these manifestos are incredibly interesting to read, and we collected a little over 400 of them, and we put them online. So if you and they go from 1492 to 1939. And so if on a Saturday afternoon you have nothing to do, you can go to our website, theinternationalistbook.com. Under the data section, we have all the manifestos posted, and you can click through them and read them. It's quite interesting.
You got to do a little better tease than that, Scott. So which one was your favorite?
Oh, definitely the first one from 1492, which was what Oona mentioned, was about wife stealing. So Maximilian the First wrote the first printed war manifesto, and he justified his going to war against Charles VIII because Charles VIII stole his wife, Anne of Brittany. And that was really amazing to us to see somebody not just openly admitting that somebody stole his wife, but trumpeting as the reason that he had the right to wage war against another country. So definitely my favorite.
Well, I mean, he's calling back to Homer, right? This is an ancient tradition in Western martial history.
No, absolutely right. So the thing is, it is true. So you have the rape of the Sabine women, you have Helen of Troy, but I kind of thought that was a justification for war that was maybe fictional and much farther in time. I was really shocked to see the first printed war manifesto to be about that, and it's actually, if you read Latin, it's actually very funny. So I for all you Latin readers out there, do yourself a favor.
I'm sure the classics reading China econ talk Venn diagram has a lot of overlap in there. But if you're out there, please let us know. So one of the interesting concepts that triggered or didn't trigger a lot of wars was the concept of neutrality and the importance of countries staying outwards, staying 100% not intervening on either side of a battle. This you guys focused on in particular. One of the reasons that the treaties in the U.S. Constitution have so much power is the fact that the founders were really scared of them tripping over this neutrality concept. So could you speak a little bit about that and how that evolved over the years?
Yeah, so I'll speak to that. So I think in some sense that was the aspect of the old world order that was most foreign to us, and in fact launched our project. So it turned what we discovered was that when political scientists had done studies of economic sanctions imposed by neutral states on belligerents, they had no examples before World War I. And that was really curious to us because it seemed like economic sanctions should have always been a tool in states' toolkits. And so we were really quite surprised to see the absence of economic sanctions before World War I. And as we did research, we found that the reason why economic sanctions were not imposed was because there was a legal duty against imposing economic sanctions. That is, because both states had the legal right of war, when there was a war, the belligerents could not be interfered with by other states lest that violate, infringe upon their right of war. In Hamilton, there's the Cabinet Battle 2 is all about the duty that the United States had not to favor France over Great Britain, because if they favored France over Great Britain, that would be an act of war, because that would be interfering with Great Britain's right to engage in force in order to enforce its rights. So kind of astonishing to us, at least, was that before 1928, war was legal, but economic sanctions were illegal because they were violations of duties of neutrality that neutral states had not to interfere with the belligerents' right of war.
So can we talk a little bit about how these rules of war played out in Asia? As you could imagine, the conceptions of interstate relations when China was an empire, not a state, and Japan was sort of doing its own thing in isolation for a couple of centuries. When they bumped up into this rule system, it initially was a very foreign encounter. So could you two talk a little bit about how this dynamic played out?
Yeah, so one of the most fascinating parts of writing the book for me was discovering this period and the ways in which the encounter between the West and Asia brought international law to Asia at the point of a gun. So we describe in the book at some length the way in which the United States really was responsible for forcing Japan open to international trade and diplomacy. Japan famously had been closed for hundreds of years at that point, had very limited trade with the Netherlands and with China, but otherwise was largely cut off from the rest of the world. And the United States sent its military commander, Commodore Matthew Perry, to force Japan into a treaty of friendship. And basically he showed up with his steamboats and said, open up to us and to trade and enter into this treaty of friendship, commerce and navigation, or else. And Japan resisted, but ultimately recognized that there was no alternative. They weren't able to compete with the armaments that the West had, and so conceded to the agreement. And they learned this lesson about how international law works. This is very poignant moment at which the Japanese leaders are meeting with the Americans and say, what is this thing, this law of nations? And they're desperate to learn what these rules are of the system. They don't even know the basics. And they send one of their scholars, young scholars off, Nishiyamani. Initially, he was going to go to the United States, but then the Civil War breaks out. So it's not a good time to go study in the United States. So instead, he goes off to the Netherlands, and he studies the rules of international law. In fact, he happens to study with a scholar who is at that very moment discovering a lost manuscript of Hugo Grotius, who is the father of the Old World Order and international law, as we described in the first part of the book. So that by this strange coincidence, Nishiyamani really imbibes directly the rules of the Old World Order from Hugo Grotius and from the great scholar of Hugo Grotius at the time, Vissering, and brings those rules back to Japan. And then Japan, fascinatingly, starts playing by the rules it's just learned. And almost immediately, within a few decades, starts doing to its neighbors what has been done to it. So shows up in Korea and almost perfectly reenacts the same set of events that had been done to them by Commodore Perry. They almost reenact that verbatim with Korea, forcing Korea into a trading relationship with Japan. So part of the story here is really about the spread of international law and the way in which force is used to bring international law to Asia, and how then Asia learns the rules of the Western legal order and then figures out how to play by the game very effectively.
China was definitely a laggard in this regard, having basically gotten taken advantage of first by the Europeans and then by the Japanese. This is certainly a function of their just like weaker military power, but also a failure of the late emperors to really understand what was at stake and how you needed to interact with these foreign countries differently in order to get successful outcomes. So fascinating. Thanks for that, and we'll come back to Asia soon. But first, I want to talk about how these rules start changing in the first half of the 20th century. So, who were the key players, and what was the impetus here?
Well, after World War I, of course, everyone is desperate to find a way to prevent war from happening again, and the Treaty of Paris and the Versailles Treaty that ends the war. The United States refuses to join it, and so the League of Nations is kind of hobbled from the start. It's a promising model, but is plagued from the beginning with difficulties, and so that doesn't seem like a sufficient solution to the problem. And there are many people trying to figure out other alternatives, other ways to end war, or to bring an end to war. And in fact, the League of Nations, while a promising model, is built very much on the Old World Order principles, which is that if you break the rules of the League of Nations, states can use war against you to enforce the rules. So instead of a rejection of the old rules, it really is kind of the last gasp in many ways of the old rules. And there's some very unlikely characters who come up with the idea that ultimately wins the day. One of the internationalists that the book is named for, is a bankruptcy lawyer in Chicago. His name's Salmon Levinson. And he really had nothing to do with international law or international politics before. He really was just a pretty successful Midwest bankruptcy lawyer. But he had two sons who had fought in the war, and he was really trying to think through, how can we bring an end to war? And he comes up with this idea, which is kind of this outlandish, crazy idea, that the way to do that is to outlaw war. It seems kind of absurd. It seemed kind of absurd to some people then. It kind of seems absurd to people today. But in fact, that idea begins to take root. He founds a non-governmental organization to fight for it, the American Committee for the Outlawry of War. He works with politicians and scholars and thinkers across the spectrum, and manages to get this movement underway for the outlawry of war. And that ultimately sets the stage for a gathering in 1928 when the nations of the world come together to renounce war as a legal institution for enforcing the rules of the system. And by the end of the year, nearly every nation in the world had signed on to that treaty. It's the much maligned Calabrian Pact, or also called the Treaty of Paris, that outlaws war. And that, we argue, really is what sets a new world in motion.
So a deep cut question here. So the Lake Mohonk Conference on International Arbitration, I used to go to as a kid, and once I started studying this stuff, was fascinated to know that this little resort played a role in this story. Could you talk a little bit about the idea of international arbitration? Who were these folks acting in the late 19th century, and how this idea kind of evolved into what ended up turning into the Kellogg-Briand Pact?
Well, there were many people who were working on these ideas. I mean, the Lake Mohonk Conference is a group of people who got together from the late 1800s to the early 1900s who are also interested in thinking through these kinds of problems. They're among the many folks who are thinking about how do we bring an end to use of force. So certainly the internationalists that we write about were not the only ones who are thinking about this question, but really the idea of outlawing war, that kind of innovation, doesn't get going until around 1918 is when Salmon Levinson publishes his first article about this idea. And what's so innovative about the Kellogg-Briand Pact that ultimately results from this idea is that it says states can no longer use a recourse to war as a tool of national policy. And that seems like not a very big deal looking at it from the modern era, but if you look back and see it against a historical backdrop, you realize that was how they had, for hundreds of years, solved their disputes when they couldn't otherwise resolve them peacefully. And war was a central tool of national policy all the way up until 1928 when they renounce it in the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And that really then, renouncing that right, taking away the right to legally use war to right various wrongs, to enforce trade relations, to enforce treaties, to collect debts, and all the other things that it used to use war for, now means they have to try and figure out other ways of doing those problems. And the problem was they hadn't really thought ahead to exactly what that was going to be. So the next 20 years is really 18 to 20 years is really a story of their figuring out, so what's going to replace war if we can't use war anymore for those purposes.
So one of the main innovations they come up with is this concept of economic sanctions. That's written in that the League of Nations ends up experimenting with against Japan, and then against Italy after Abyssinia. Could you talk a little bit about the intellectual foundations of that and how sanctions played out pre World War II? Yeah.
So as I mentioned, after they pass the Kellogg-Briand Pact, they then have the problem of, well, wait a minute, how are we going to enforce these rules? And the first real challenge is when Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. So not long after everyone has ratified the Kellogg-Briand Pact, including both Japan and China have ratified the pact. And this is clearly in violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact's rules. And the question then becomes, well, how are we going to enforce these rules? We've all just signed a pact saying that we're not going to use war as a tool of national policy. So it'd be kind of an absurd thing to use war to enforce a prohibition on war. But how are we going to enforce the rules? And it takes a lot of effort to try and think through the answer to that question. And by a strange coincidence, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Henry Stimson, had been classmates at Yale with Salmon Levinson, the father of the outlawry movement. And Salmon had sent Henry a set of writings that he had done about peaceful sanctions for international law, and particularly for violations of the pact. And his idea was, instead of having sanctions of war, we should have sanctions of peace. And the sanctions of peace were these economic sanctions, effectively, and denying recognition of illegal conquests of the kind that was happening in Manchuria. And Stimson seizes on this idea as a great way to enforce the pact and issues what famously becomes known as the Stimson Doctrine, that is, a doctrine of non-recognition of illegal conquest, which entails a range of economic sanctions, non-recognition of passports, not allowing stamps issued by the puppet state of Manchukuo to be recognized, not engaging in international commerce with Manchukuo, which is, again, the puppet state that Japan has set up in Manchuria, and refusing generally to acknowledge this as being a legal seizure of territory. That's really the first time economic sanctions had been used to enforce international law in this way. And it becomes the beginning of a new tool for enforcing international law and the rules of the international legal order that becomes essential to our modern era.
If I could just jump in just to add that that part of the story we tell is also trying to understand how the Japanese understood the change that was brought about in 1928 when they signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And from their perspective, they did not fully appreciate the revolutionary change that renouncing the right of war would set into motion. So from their perspective, they did not imagine that by signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact, that would now legitimate economic sanctions being placed on them for their actions in East Asia. So when in 1940, the United States imposed sanctions on Japan for their conquests in Manchuria and Indochina and other areas in South Asia, from their perspective, that was a violation of the duty of neutrality, which was a core principle of the Old World Order, which had been imposed upon them only several decades before. So from their perspective, at least, the retaliation of Pearl Harbor was a justified action because the United States was violating the principles of law which they thought were still operative. And the United States really had only changed its official position about economic sanctions only 6 months before Pearl Harbor. So when understood in the larger arc of history, the war in the Pacific really was a war of two clashing visions of how the world was supposed to work. Japan still operating under the principles of the Old World Order, and the United States operating with this new understanding of war being illegitimate, but economic sanctions being legitimate.
Let's take this story a few years forward to during World War II, when the U.S. and other powers were trying to figure out how to shape the new world order and enshrine these new principles into something that hopefully would be more sustainable than the League of Nations ended up turning out to be.
Yeah. So after World War II, the question was, once again, how do we end war? How do we effectively meet the promise of the Kellogg-Briand Pact? And in fact, we describe in the book the process that gets underway well before the end of the war. As early as 1941, there's meetings beginning to be held in the Department of State on exactly this question, which is, okay, after the war, what institutions are we going to put in place to keep the peace? There's a group convened in the Department of State by one of our internationalists, Sumner Wells, who's an Undersecretary of State, and he gathers together a bunch of experts to try and think through this question. And it turns out that one of the experts he brings into the group is James Shotwell, another one of our internationalists, who was a history professor, medieval history professor at Columbia, but who, by strange coincidence, that we describe at some length in the book, it actually is the person who ghost wrote the proposal for the Calabrian Pact for Briand, the French foreign minister, to propose back to the United States. And so they have the very person who had written the Calabrian Pact in this working group in the early 1940s, and he really writes the first draft of the UN Charter, which we discovered in the archives in the Roosevelt Library. And the very first draft, in fact, literally reproduces the Calabrian Pact at the beginning of the draft of the UN Charter, and then lays out a set of institutions to try and make that promise a reality. It gets revised over time, and so the what was the Calabrian Pact now is reflected in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of states, against sovereign states. And then there's this whole machinery built up around it to try and make that effective. You have the Security Council, you have the General Assembly, you have all these institutional elements that are there that weren't in the original pact. The original pact was very short. In fact, it could fit on a postcard. And the modern era is really the story of taking that promise and making it a reality by building all sets of institutions around it, like the World Trade Organization, like the World Bank, like all these international agreements and institutions and organizations that are built on the principle, which assumes you can't use war to get what you want. You've got to use international cooperation instead.
So 2 points before we turn to the next part of this book. So while Sumner Wells and Shotwell may have written the first draft, after Sumner was lost his position due to a rumors of a sex scandal on a train, Leo Pasvolsky took over, and though shamefully did not make more than 2 sentences of your book, was my thesis, my undergraduate thesis topic, and played a significant role in building out that initial idea to something a little more fully formed. The other thing to mention here is China does play a small role. Wellington Koo was invited to as the Chinese representative when the big four powers were meeting at Dumbarton Oaks. Except he wasn't invited to all the meetings, so they would tell him to show up a few hours late after the Soviet Union, the UK, and the US had their real talks. So he was very upset about having to sweat in the summer, I believe, of 1944 in Washington D.C. and not getting to have any of the fun. So one of
can I just say one thing, Jordan?
Sure.
I think that isn't this right, Oona? We included a picture in the book precisely because it had Wellington Koo in it. Isn't that true?
Yeah, he's in there. As is Leo Pavolsky. By the way, he does appear. Obviously, was a key figure, and one of the hard things here is there's so many interesting, important people that we can't give them all entirely their due, given that we're covering several hundred years of history. But I think part of the reason we focused on the people we did is we focused on the people who kind of had the initial innovative insights. What we were really interested in is, who's the person kind of setting things in motion? Who's the person who has this innovative idea about how to organize things? And Leo, I think he's brilliant in kind of execution, and he is really important in kind of making it come to fruition. And he's widely recognized as really one of the great experts, and without whom, arguably, it would not have been as successful as it was. But he wasn't really, and he was part of this working group, so he was part of that as well. But as far as we could tell, he wasn't really the guy who had the idea. He was the guy that once the idea was there, he was very good at helping to make it a reality. On Wellington Koo, he's a really important figure here, and we do talk about him several times in the book. One aspect that was sort of an interesting discovery for me, I guess I had sort of known this, but I hadn't really fully appreciated it, was that when they're deciding who were going to be the permanent 5 members of the Security Council who are given this really prominent role. They're each given a veto over authorizations to use force by the new United Nations and the new United Nations Security Council. So this is a really powerful seat. And interestingly, it's the Americans who are arguing for including China on the Security Council, which is something of an irony given that they have been at loggerheads for much of the last 50, 60 years on the Security Council, not always, but frequently disagreeing over the course of action in the UN. And part of the reason the U.S. was so insistent about including China was that everyone so liked Wellington Koo and saw him as brilliant, as incredibly thoughtful, as a constructive member of the conversation, and as really a important member of the diplomacy that had led to the creation of the United Nations. It's also interesting that the reason the Chinese were not included in all the meetings of the Dumbarton Oaks is because the Soviets wouldn't meet with them. The Soviets refused to be in the same room with them, which is, again, another irony, because that, of course, then, allegiances switch after the fall of Chiang Kai-shek. So it's a fascinating part of the story, I think, that's underappreciated. My students are always amazed and surprised to realize that actually it was one of the main reasons China is on the Security Council is because the United States insisted on it. And the U.S., by the way, was a little skeptical of including France. So go figure. History turns out in surprising ways.
For sure. So one of the I excuse your I accept your excuse for not giving more of Leo giving Leo more of a script. I've now sold. So the next part of your book is my personal favorite. You guys do a fantastic job walking through the Nuremberg trials and make it a really dramatic and shockingly well written account of the legal arguments, which I'm sure was not something all that easy to do. As you guys mentioned, the dominant emotion of folks who were in that courtroom was actually one of boredom, not one of excitement. So could you talk a little bit about this Nuremberg narrative and how it plays into the themes we're talking about right now?
Yeah, sure. So I think we normally think of the Nuremberg trial in 1945 as the trial where the Holocaust was prosecuted. But in fact, at the time, the main purpose of the trial and why the United States pushed so hard to have an international trial was they wanted to prosecute the Nazis for waging an aggressive war under the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And the story that we tell is not just the story of how they managed to convince the president and the other allies to join in this international tribunal to try the Nazis, but also this backstory of these two lawyers, one Carl Schmitt and the other Hans Kelsen, Carl Schmitt, the so-called crown jurist of the Third Reich, and Hans Kelsen, often considered one of the most important legal theorists of the 20th century, one Nazi, the other Jew, both are longtime bitter enemies who have an ongoing feud over the course of 20 years about the nature of international law and the right of war, and how Carl Schmitt hears about the Kellogg-Briand Pact when James Shotwell gives a lecture in Berlin in 1927 and realizes immediately that if the world outlaws war, that Germany is going to be at risk of being prosecuted for waging an aggressive war if they go to war again and lose. And you have on the other side Hans Kelsen, who is a Jew and who is Schmitt's bitter enemy, who works with Justice Jackson when he's the chief prosecutor for the United States in Nuremberg using the Kellogg-Briand Pact exactly in the way in which Carl Schmitt argued it would be used. And in fact, Carl Schmitt is interned for 2 years for his participation in the Nazi regime, precisely for violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So it's a kind of crazy story of somebody who's an enemy of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, but recognizes the revolution it would bring about, ultimately being ensnared by the trap he tried to tell Germany about, and on the opposite side of this Jewish Austrian law professor who he had been fighting with for 20 years, helps to assemble the legal argument against his compatriots and ultimately against Carl Schmitt himself 20 years later.
There are not many better legal revenge stories than this one, to be sure.
Yes.
So coming now to the world that these new norms create, let's talk a little bit about the concept of outcasting. As we all know, China, of course, lost its Security Council seat for a number of years after Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan, where I'm currently recording this from. And that period of outcasting played a huge role in China's in China's development in the 20th century. So what was this idea, and how was it implemented over post World War II?
Yeah, so the basic idea is that instead of enforcing the rules with war or with force, the way that you enforce them is by creating collective benefits of global cooperation and then pulling back those benefits from anybody who's a bad actor. And so just to give an example, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the successor to it, the World Trade Organization, the way in which it enforces its rules is not by sending in the United Nations Army, which there isn't one, to enforce the rules. But the way in which it enforces the rules is that if you break the rules, you put in place an illegal tariff, then the state that is harmed by that can sue. And if you're found to be in violation of the rules, then a state is allowed to basically break the rules back. So that is a version of outcasting. It is you're outcasted for breaking the rules, and that is you lose some of the benefits, the protection of the rules that you'd otherwise be entitled to as long as you continue to be a rule breaker. Economic sanctions are a key part of this too. For instance, human rights violations can be met with economic sanctions. For a long time, China was met with economic sanctions over its human rights practices. Now, this process of enforcing the rules is remarkably effective, but it does have its downsides. It can be frustrated. It can be weakened. And one of the interesting aspects of the post-World War II era, and particularly China's relationship to this process of outcasting, is that China has, in some notable instances, been a bit of a spoiler of the effort to try and outcast states. So when, for instance, no one would buy oil from Sudan because of its engaging in genocidal practices, China was willing to enter into some pretty big oil contracts. And, economically it was pretty smart because they got a lower price for the oil than otherwise would have. But it then muted the effects of outcasting on the Sudanese government, which were intended to prevent it or discourage it from continuing its genocide in Darfur. So it's not a perfect system. It's not always perfectly effective, but we detail in the book some ways in which it is a powerful tool, although not an all-powerful tool for enforcing the rules in the post-World War II era.
So I think it's important to reflect a little bit just on the twists and turns that the reigning government in Beijing has changed in their worldview towards the world order. I mean, we're coming from in the 18th century. We have the emperor telling McCarthy that, we're the center, we're the Celestial Empire, we're the center of the world, we have no use for your silly trinkets. Going from that to Wellington coup with his well-coiffed smooth words at the Dumbarton Oaks, then turning to Mao, who's trying to push global revolution. And here we have a leadership today that, by and large, has basically bought into organizations like the world, like the WTO, and like the UN Security Council. So, even though, of course, there are some, China definitely has some issues with the global state of affairs. The extent to which China has bought in is a really remarkable one, and I think speaks to the power of how these norms have really played out over the past really only 75 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think what the moment we're at is such an interesting one, because we're seeing the moment at which the United States is suddenly expressing ambivalence about a lot of the institutions that it was crucial in creating in the post-war era, and is, Trump at least is suggesting a kind of pullback from some of these core institutions. Suggested he might be interested in withdrawing from the World Trade Organization, and suggested that he might want to defund some UN practices and activities, and suggested that he's not really committed to a lot of these core institutions. And at the same moment, you see, as the story you opened with suggests, China realizing this is a real opportunity for China to come in and play a role as a global leader and try and set the rules of the game in ways that it finds friendly to itself. And I think the real question is going to be, what does that look like? What are those rules? Does China envision kind of taking the leadership and taking the reins and playing the role of a responsible world leader in ensuring that the rules of the game are played fairly? Or does it have an idea about how it wants to revamp or reframe those rules? And if so, what would those be? And there's a little bit of a kind of schizophrenia about China's relationship right now to some of these legal orders. Certainly it's been an active player in the World Trade Organization since it joined, and that, I think, has been a really powerful and productive addition to the World Trade Organization practices. But there have been other places where it has been reluctant to play by the rules. It's party to the Law of the Sea Convention, for instance, which is a good thing. The U.S. is not party to the Law of the Sea Convention, interestingly. But then when the arbitration between the Philippines and China over China's pretty aggressive claims in the South China Sea went against China, China refused to recognize the jurisdiction of their arbitral body and has refused to recognize its decision in what seems to be a pretty clear violation of the Law of the Sea Convention. So that raises real questions about, are they going to pick and choose where they're going to follow the rules? And, if so, what does that mean for the future of the legal order? And are they going to play this spoiler role that they have occasionally played in kind of snapping up things that are deals because nobody else will trade with bad actors? Or are they going to say, you know what, no, we are no longer going to play that role. Like, we actually do expect you to play by the rules. And, we're not going to take the deal, but we're going to actually hold you to meeting the obligations of the Genocide Convention or other obligations under the international legal order. And frankly, at this moment, I'm not sure we know what that's going to look like. I think we know that there's an ambition to play a greater leadership role, and I think that could be a good thing. But we don't really know. We don't really know how productive it's going to be, what direction China wants to take those rules in. Does it want to, for instance, shut down freedom of speech, political organization? Does it want to reflect its own domestic policies onto the international order? If so, I think many of us would find that quite troubling. So, I think there's a lot still to be seen about what engagement by China means, and I'm not sure we have a good idea of that yet.
And the leadership itself also may not really understand what these are baby steps that that the Chinese government is playing on the world stage now, and ones that they were frankly not expected to be able to play given the decisions Trump has made over the past year.
Yeah, I mean, he's created a real opening. I mean, he's created a huge vacuum, and the question is what's going to fill that vacuum. And China rightly sees an opportunity to fill that vacuum. But as I think you are right to say, I'm not sure they anticipated this opportunity coming so early. And they may not have fully thought through what does that mean to fill the vacuum and how are they going to fill it and what are those rules going to look like. And, you know, much of the next 10 to 20 years and the success of the international legal order could very much turn on the decisions that they make on precisely those questions.
So as nice as a point... As nice a point as this sounds to end on, I do have one more question. One of the more creative arguments that I thought was particularly well played out in your book talks about just why these island disputes are so intractable and have had such a hard time. One of the quotes you say is that because the islands and the islands in the South China Sea in particular, but other small disputes around the world were virtually worthless a century ago, makes them such a source of conflict today. So could you expand on that thought? Explain the kind of turning point in history where if you hadn't resolved your border dispute by it's kind of lingered until the present day, and what that sort of means for international law today.
Yeah. So what we discovered was that many of the territorial disputes in the world are around islands, which seems like kind of a puzzling thing. Why in the world is it the case that the islands are so? It's not just in the South China Sea, around the world, are such a source of dispute, and we realized a few reasons for that. So before 1928, islands, unless they could be used to grow valuable things like spices, which was true of some islands, particularly in Asia, but islands for the most part were kind of a big cost and not a lot of benefit. In a world where conquest was perfectly legal and legitimate and states could take things from you if they had a reasonably colorable claim for doing so, having an island meant you had to defend it, and defending it meant you had to garrison it, and that could be expensive and difficult and time-consuming. And so islands were generally not really something that states particularly cared to have unless, again, they were big enough to sustain human life, and you could actually have people living on them or growing things on them. And so even when there were these treaties between states, they often didn't even bother to mention these islands because nobody considered them really worth mentioning. And that changes for several reasons. First, in 1928, when conquest gets outlawed and war gets outlawed, well, all of a sudden now having an island doesn't mean that you have to defend it. It means that now it's yours and others can't take it away from you legally. And so the cost side of the equation significantly goes down. And all the lines of sovereignty begin to firm up in 1928. Basically, if you have territory up to 1928, now that's yours. Wherever the lines of sovereignty are clear, those lines now firm up in 1928 because of the prohibition on war and the necessary that goes along with that, which is the prohibition on conquest. And then add to that two things. One is in the 70s and 80s, a development of technology to be able to begin to explore oil resources under the ocean, and a realization there's lots of oil under the sea, and a treaty that comes into place, the Law of the Sea Convention, which which lays out the rules for who owns what in the ocean, and it gives islands a great deal of territorial sea in what's called an exclusive economic zone. That is the rights to basically exploit the resources under the ocean for 200 miles around each island, and it could be up to 350 if it has a large continental shelf around it. So all of a sudden, islands are worth a huge amount when they were before basically worthless. And so that sets off this race to claim control over islands. But they've run into this problem, which is that there's historically not real clarity about who the islands belong to, and everyone has different claims. And that's the situation we're running into in the South China Sea. You have some areas where there are multiple states who claim to have historic rights, and they rest on very thin ice. Vietnam's claims in some cases are, well, we used to go scavenge these rocks to take things off of them when ships would run onto them and leave valuable things behind, or our fishermen used to go and dry their fish on these rocks and therefore they're ours. Or China, with its 9-dash line, is, well, we have maps that show that this was all ours. And we used to patrol this part of the South China Sea. They're very insistent on emphasizing. So, and there's not really any easy way to resolve this. I mean, in the modern era, you can't just take it, although China is certainly trying to do that. And the only way to resolve it is through dispute resolution or through agreement. And thus far, that hasn't brought an end to the disputes. As I mentioned, the arbitration award, which went largely against China, China is refusing to recognize. So the only way to get an end to this is basically if all the states who are involved agree to it, and that could take a long time.
So another one of the main disadvantage, or probably the most important disadvantage of this system as opposed to the past world order is, of course, the proliferation of civil wars and the growth of failed states and failing states that probably would have been gobbled up by larger, stronger ones in a prior era, but aren't quite with us today. So even though we've been talking about outlawing war, which thank God we didn't have a great power conflict after World War II, but at the same time there are certainly downsides like the difficulty in resolving these sorts of territorial disputes, as well as the proliferation of different types of conflict. But instead of getting into that, I have one final question for both of you. So coming back to where we started with this idea of changing the sort of international norms. Basically, it took 2 entire world wars to really have nations reshape the way they think about this sort of thing. So I'm curious, regardless of whether or not change would be for good or for ill, or in China's liking or not to China's liking, do you and this is a question for both of you, do you think it takes this sort of global international cataclysmic conflict to reshape the way humans think about these sorts of things, or can subtle change over time actually have really dramatic effects?
Well, I think the story of certainly I hope the answer to that is it doesn't take cataclysmic conflict to bring about change, because if it does, we're in some serious trouble.
Well, then again, maybe we don't need change. Maybe this is a halfway decent point of equilibrium where, yes, we do have a number of civil wars and civil conflicts, but there hasn't been a great power war for the past, since 1945.
Yeah. So I think that the story of the book is that, yes, it took the war to resolve the fight over what exactly the pact meant. There were states that didn't buy into the idea that the pact actually meant no more war, Japan and Germany and Italy in particular. And to resolve that fight, the only way to resolve it was war, it turned out. But a lot of the story of the book is also about incremental change. So is about how once the pact was put in place, the really interesting story is the effort of the internationalists to figure out what would it mean to create a world order based on the foundational rule that states can't use war to get what they want. They've got to find other ways to get what they want from each other. And that diplomacy was going to have to be based not on an assumption that war was the backup, but that they were going to have to find other ways to back it up. And so it is really a story about how incremental change can, over time, bring about a real significant reorienting of the international legal order that, I should say, can be good and it can be bad. And we end the book by saying that we may be in the midst of incremental change headed in the wrong direction. That we could be in the midst of a moment when we're weakening the commitment to our prohibition on war and the prohibition on use of aggressive force in a variety of ways, and withdrawing from these international institutions that are key to keeping the peace. And that incremental change can cause a breakdown in the system, and that could end up leading to a cataclysmic conflict. And that's certainly, what part of what we're trying to warn against in the book is not to let that happen, and be careful about imperiling the world order that we have, which has been successful at keeping unprecedented peace, not without its problems, obviously, but still unprecedented peace for much of the last 7 decades.
I would I would just add to that, but by just distinguishing between kind of revolution and evolution. So fundamental change in the world order probably can't come about unless there is some cataclysm, and that's because in order to get everyone in the world to change and to converge on the same basic set of rules requires some incredible reason to change, which would probably only happen if there was some terrible conflict with one side winning and imposing its rules over the other half. And that's partly what happens from 1928 to 1945, when the United States is almost the last nation standing and imposes these set of rules which had developed from 1928 on the part of the world that lost. But the evolutionary story, where you take the basic framework and then you develop institutions, and those institutions develop new techniques, and then that doesn't require a cataclysm. That requires people thinking about how to improve the world and working together. So, for example, the part of the story that we tell in the book is the new developments in sanctioning and outcasting, which led to the Iran nuclear deal, which is a very sophisticated form of sanctioning Iran from the global banking system, which took a lot of thought and trial and error in sanctioning to develop. Now, that is an incremental change, but it was an incremental change that takes place within the broad framework where you're not supposed to go to war in order to resolve the dispute. You're supposed to engage in some form of outcasting. So in the developments in the United States, for example, have not been promising in the last year, with the hollowing out of the State Department and the Foreign Service. Like, these are the people who are supposed to think about evolutionary change in the basic framework, and for the United States government to retreat from thinking diplomatically to thinking about how to make incremental change, we're risking making some kind of fundamental change which we'll all regret.
So it's interesting to think about, and you sort of alluded to this, the role of technology and in how these sorts of things play out. So the creation of the atom bomb is of course the most obvious example, but if the international financial system wasn't as closely tied together, Iran wouldn't have any exposure to Western banks, so the U.S. wouldn't have been able to inflict any pain on that sense. So maybe another big push in evolution is not just the norms, but also things like drones or cyber war, other things that require or may not require new international regulation or norm development that these countries have to grapple with.
Yeah, for example, cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency may very well be a way in which states do an end run around the global banking system. So as the world changes, the institutions have to adapt to these changes, and it's very worrying if a major player like the United States cedes that ground because we're not sure what will fill the void.
So on that ominous note, I think we're going to call it a day. Thanks so much, you two, and I really couldn't recommend this book any higher. It's something, if I had gotten a PhD, something I wish I would have written. It's really clear, has a lot of interesting characters and a real narrative thread, which you would not expect from a book about international legal intellectual history. So I want to say thanks again for coming on the show, for writing such an interesting piece, and hope to have another excuse to sort of not really talk about China with you two guys at some point in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It was really enjoyable. Thank you so much, Jordan.